I want to talk today about the teaching of astrology. Most astrologers in the United States have learned their astrology in one of two ways. They've either studied it through books, or they've taken classes through another astrologer, generally an astrologer, who has a pretty fair professional practice. And so what I want to address is how that works, how well it works, and whether it's actually enough as a teaching system to produce astrologers who themselves are good vocationally. Okay, well, the way that it usually works when people are learning astrology from books is they read the books that interest them. I mean, this is what people do anyway when they read books. So what you get from that is basically somebody who finds a particular style of astrology very compelling, whether it's psychological astrology or classical astrology or Vedic astrology, or esoteric astrology, it doesn't matter, but in any case, the person tends to read books of interest and probably books on related subjects. Now, of course, the point that teaching astrologers have made about this process of book learning is it's all well and good to read the books, but you have to actually work the charts. And I would certainly agree with that. I've certainly said that in my books. So you take a class from somebody to work the charts, and so what happens in the class is everybody whips out their own birth data. You work on everybody's natal chart. In the more advanced classes every week, whoever is in the news or whatever event is in the news becomes an example. And so this is used by way of showing people how aspects work, or how rulerships work, or how any other component in astrology works. What I want to ask is whether this works. And the answer to whether it works is a rather simple question. If you've been studying this way for a year, 2 years, 3 years, what happens to you when you see a brand new chart? Can you read it cold? Okay. Now, when I say cold, what I'm really saying is this. Can you read it without having to pull out a flock of books to look up Venus in Cancer or Mars in Sagittarius, or what the meaning of Mars square Venus is? Do you have that in your head? When you see the chart, do you feel compelled to go back to books to be able to look up the general delineation? Because I would argue that if you do, you haven't really learned astrology yet, and probably it's not your fault. Because what is happening there is you're not getting enough of the matrix of how the system works to be able to hang together a coherent reading. Now, why aren't you getting enough? Well, it's probably not because the astrologer you're learning from isn't trying. It's probably not because the books you're reading are lousy books. What it is that the assumption that you can learn isolated rules and come up with a coherent whole is not something that hardly any society, historically or culturally, has accepted as a viable learning practice. The thing is, it's great to learn procedures, but procedures don't work in isolation. And what I'd like to point out is that there are two pieces to astrological education that you well may be missing because you didn't appreciate, and you weren't taught to appreciate, that these were vital and necessary things in order to end up being able to manipulate the procedures well. Now, the first, which seems kind of weird, is history. But if you don't study history, you don't know how people have approached the same problem over time and in different cultures. And often knowing different ways that people have done this gives you hints for ways that you can do it. But the second one is probably even bigger, and that's the topic of critical thinking. Critical thinking is something that is taught in college, but often not overtly, and until recently, almost never overtly. And critical thinking is really the basis of what was called the liberal arts education, because what it was about was an attempt to get people to contextualize a problem or a question in a way that they would realize that they would have multiple approaches, and they would have what we call a critical apparatus to approach them. Now, what does that mean in practice? Well, one of the hardest things I find in teaching horary is people can sit down, they can learn all the rules, they can go through the first house and the second house and so forth. But then they see a chart in front of them and they freeze. Well, why do they freeze? Well, they kind of know what their procedures are, but they somehow, in the back of their minds, are worried that maybe they're not applying the procedures right. Maybe they haven't picked the right houses. Those are the issues that stick for people. I'll give you a simple example. This came up a couple of weeks ago. One of my horary students had called me up to look at a chart that she had gotten from a woman who had asked whether she would be a judge on American Idol. Well, my student had gone through my textbook on horary astrology and looked at the sections on the 10th house and the 6th house. And because this woman was nowhere high in the hierarchy of American Idol, she was definitely an employee, my student picked 6th house. And I looked at this and I said, okay, well now tell me something about how this works on American Idol because I've never seen the program. Are the judges publicly there? Are they interviewed? Does somebody say, now why did you pick, person A over person B? And she said, yeah, they're up front, and they do get interviewed and so forth. And I'm thinking to myself, well, the thing is that while this person is nowhere like a top person, a top dog like you'd normally think of for 10th house, they're still a judge. And even though this is kind of a joke, this isn't really legal or anything else, they are giving all the proper public trappings. That makes it a 10th house matter. So what's happening there is I'm going through a kind of a longer, in this case, critical thinking process. And what I would add is, you can't get that whole thing out of a book. Well, how do you get it? Well, you get it when the approach to teaching is not, this is what to do. You get it when the approach to teaching is, how would you approach this? And where the instructor and the class are open to the possibility of multiple answers, because it's in the exploration that you actually learn the logic to apply. And that kind of open-ended procedure, see how well this illustrates this point, is a much better teaching mechanism to help you, the student, when you get approached by somebody and you're looking at a chart you've never seen and you're being asked questions that you've never had to deal with.